Thank you, Doctor. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I congratulate you for doing these health forums. I know you've done a whole series of them. It's extremely important when you're dealing with an issue this complex, which has this many moving parts and which is really constantly changing. I mean, every day it changes. That these type of informational events occur. So it's really an excellent initiative that you've undertaken here, and I thank you for including me in it. To come to the House side is, of course, an honor for any member of the Senate. We're greatly privileged to have this opportunity. And I used to be a member of the House, and a great admirer of the House and its actions and its activities. But the rules are different between the House and the Senate. And bodies are different. The intention of the founders in structuring the two bodies was fundamentally different. And why do I mention that? Because the issue of reconciliation goes right to the core of the purposes of the Senate in the process of the constitutional development of law under our system. Let's begin with the obvious. Nobody would have to use the railroad effect of reconciliation, and it is a railroading effect when you basically can run something through the Senate without debate, 20 hours, no amendments essentially, up and down vote, 50 votes, get the Vice President to vote with you. No, that would not, this process would not even be in play were we dealing with a product which was bipartisan, which had any significant bipartisan support. Because clearly, then you would not need to proceed in this sort of extraordinarily heavy-handed, as was the doctor said, nuclear approach to the parliamentary procedure. So that's the first obvious. This process, first, we should be doing a bipartisan bill. I mean, when you're dealing with health care, which is 16% of our economy, which affects everybody's life in a very personal way, this bill is going to have an impact on every American in an immediate and personal way. You shouldn't be doing it in a partisan. You should be doing it in a bipartisan way so that the American people are comfortable that whatever the final product is, it was fairly arrived at and it was appropriately developed, and that it wasn't done with one side gaming the other side, which is what, in this instance, reconciliation is all about. Well, where does reconciliation come from and what's the concept? For those of you familiar with the House rules and the way the House works, you have something called the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee controls the floor of the House. And the Rules Committee is entirely controlled by the majority party. It's populated by a membership of 2 to 1 plus 1, I believe, or at least that's the way it was when I was here, so that the majority can never lose a rule. And the rule, once issued by the Rules Committee, determines when a bill comes to the floor, how long the debate will be, how many amendments will be on the bill, and then when the vote will occur. So that if you want to pass a bill in an hour, the Rules Committee can issue a rule that says there will be an hour of debate, no amendments. The bill gets passed in an hour if the majority supports the bill. So that's the way the House works. In the Senate, we have no Rules Committee. The Senate is constructed to have every individual senator basically be a player and have the capacity to have impact on every piece of legislation that comes to the floor of the Senate. The way that George Washington described this was that, as we all know, Washington said that the Senate is the saucer into which the hot coffee is poured. The idea was that the Senate would be a cooling off place where legislation which moved through the populist fervor of the House would come to the Senate and basically slow down, and sometimes just plain stop. The idea being that we were going to be a government of checks and balances, not only between the legislative, executive, and judiciary branch, but that we would be a government of checks and balances. This was the concept of Madison within the legislative branch, and the ultimate check is the Senate. That's why it's called the world's greatest deliberative body, because its purpose is to deliberate. It is to listen, it is to debate, and it is to amend. Well, over the years, that right of every senator to come to the floor and debate and amend every piece of legislation that comes to the floor evolved into the filibuster. And the filibuster, of course, as you all know, is the capacity of one senator to hold up any piece of legislation for as long as that senator wishes to hold up that piece of legislation, or until 60 senators decide they're tired of it. They're tired of that piece of legislation being held up, or they've decided they want to pass that piece of legislation, and then they vote, 60 senators vote to cut off the filibuster. And so the single senator or group of senators who are trying to slow that piece of legislation down, if they can't get 41 votes in their favor, the bill moves forward. Their within the Senate rules, 3 major points of filibuster on any given bill. And so it really is a right of senators to essentially force a piece of legislation to be considered at considerable length. Even if a filibuster is cut off, even if there's what's called cloture on a filibuster, you still get 2 more shots at it, and post-cloture you get 30 hours of debate. So I mean, you can drag out a piece of legislation where 60 people want to pass it for literally weeks because of the 30-hour debate and the 3 cloture events. And this has happened in the past, where there has been a working majority that wanted to pass something, but there's been a very firm minority that didn't want to pass something. We've seen the majority, the working majority, have to go through 2-3 filibuster events in order to get 2 or 3 cloture events on filibusters in order to get final passage, and it can take 2 or 3 weeks depending on how the majority leader who controls the floor at the time decides to pursue it. Well, when the Budget Act was passed, there was a recognition after it had been in place for a while. It was passed in the mid-70s. There was a recognition after it had been in place for a while that the rules of the Budget Act, which required committees to basically send out of their committee legislation which met the budget, had no enforcement mechanism. And so, even though we had a budget, and even though committees were supposed to be able to were supposed to meet the budget, there was no way to enforce that. And so in the 1980s, there was a decision made that we should have reconciliation, and that we should have the capacity to force budgets. Was it in the 80s? Reconciliation? 74, okay. I'm sorry, I've been confused. But the reconciliation language was put into the Budget Act for the purposes of forcing the committees to conform with the budget instructions as to how much they were to spend or to cut in spending, or to tax or cut in taxes. And initially, it became clear, and it was put in the context of the Budget Act as a limitation on time. Now, the Budget Act itself is the only vehicle, the budget's the only vehicle that comes to the floor of the Senate with a limited amount of time for debate, 50 hours. So when we take up a Budget Act, you got 50 hours to pass it. And that was a decision that was made that the budget shouldn't be filibusterable when it was passed. And you can amend the Budget Act during those 50 hours, but at the end of the 50 hours you have to vote on it, or you have to vote on all the amendments that are pending or over. So there is a finite time. Reconciliation was put in place for the purposes of making sure that committees could, when they were directed to cut or to spend or to do something that involved actions in the compensation or monetary area, but in the monetary area of spending or reducing spending, that they complied with the Budget Act. And there was a limit on the reconciliation, 20 hours of debate and essentially no amendments of any practical purpose, and then a vote on that. But what happened during the initial period of reconciliation back in the early 80s, and that's where I got my days confused, back in the early 80s, was that people started to use reconciliation as a vehicle to pass all sorts of things which are extraneous to the budget. All sorts of social concepts and desired political and legislative events which had nothing to do with spending, had nothing to do with tax policy. And so it became a vehicle that was used during the early 80s for the purposes of accomplishing that. Well, in 1984, Senator Byrd said, enough's enough. We're going to put in a rule that says the purposes of reconciliation are for the purposes of adjusting the numbers for the budget to make sure that people meet the budget, and that is the goal of reconciliation. It can't be used for an extraneous policy activity. So that became known as the Byrd rule. This has all evolved through time to today, when we are now confronted with the issue of whether or not reconciliation is a proper vehicle to use for the purposes of passing health care reform. Now, over the years, reconciliation has been used for a number of policy issues. It was used, of course, for the tax cuts, for the Bush tax cuts in the beginning of the 2000 period. It was used under Clinton's term for a major reconciliation bill that adjusted spending in the entitlement accounts of Medicare specifically. And it's been used in a couple of other instances. People will argue, well, since it's been used in the past for policy activity, why isn't it correct to do it today for health care? And let me address that issue first, because that's the most common argument you hear, that you should be able to use reconciliation today for health care because, well, it was used for the Bush tax cuts in 81 or 83. The reason it doesn't work, the reason that argument doesn't carry water, is that the Bush tax cuts were in the context of a surplus. There was, at the time, a projected $5.6 trillion surplus over that 10-year period. The Bush tax cuts represented about a $1.3 trillion reduction in that surplus through tax cuts. The Democratic Party came to the floor with an alternative, which was also about $1.3 trillion of tax cuts, but they had them in different places. But the point was we were dealing with a major surplus situation. That's the first point. Secondly, the tax cuts were the policy which was already in place and already fairly well defined. In fact, very well defined. Basically, we were changing rate structure, going from a dividend rate of, depending on what your income was, of up to 35% to a dividend rate of 15%, going from a capital gains rate of 20% down to 15%, going from the top marginal rate of about 35%, about 39% down to 35%. So these were not major new initiatives in policy. They were adjustments to already existing policy. Of course, with health care, we're dealing with an entirely different animal. It's like comparing apples and oranges to say those tax cuts, which were done in the context of a period of projected major surplus, and which were done in the context of the already existing policy, and were simply numbers adjustments to policy, have any reasonable comparison to a change in healthcare policy, which will be a brand new, major policy for this country, which will, as I said, affect every American and 16% of our economy. A better comparison would be if you were to use reconciliation for the purposes of putting in place a national sales tax, a value-added tax. Now that wouldn't be available under reconciliation, in my opinion, because that's a major new policy. It's a fundamental change in policy, and it's a brand new initiative. That's more identical or more similar to what we're seeing today with this healthcare policy. So when you're taking something that is totally outside the budget realm, and which has very little relationship to the purposes of budgeting, and try to shoehorn that into reconciliation, on its face, you shouldn't be able to accomplish that. But when you're doing something this huge, the single biggest piece of public policy probably addressed, and it's in the post-World War II period, the total rewrite of our health care laws with the potential of nationalization of our health care laws if the government plan is successful. Clearly, that should not be shoehorned into a reconciliation instruction. And the definitiveness of the inappropriateness of this is shown by the fact that the reconciliation instructions aren't meant to adjust the budget. They are meant to create massive new policy, because the reconciliation instructions were that there would only be $1 billion savings that were supposed to be created to the deficit over a 5-year period by the Finance Committee, and $1 billion of savings that were supposed to be created to the deficit over a 5-year period to the Health Committee, which is, $1 billion is a lot of money, but on the context of our entire budget over 5 years, it's virtually, well, it doesn't even appear as an asterisk, it's so small. So the purpose wasn't to adjust the budget, and the purpose wasn't to create savings and to create adjustments which would affect a more sound budget. The purpose was of reconciliation, clearly, to give a vehicle to allow a massive expansion in public policy and change in public policy to have the protection of reconciliation instructions. As I mentioned earlier, reconciliation only takes 50 votes to pass, plus the Vice President. So it's a 51-vote passage at the end of 20 hours of debate. But a reconciliation bill itself is subject to all sorts of points of order. And it's a very convoluted exercise in parliamentary activity. probably the most arcane and Byzantine parliamentary exercise that the Senate has is testing whether or not a reconciliation, certainly of anything of the nature of a health care bill, meets the various levels of points of order. There are about 18 points of order, and when you raise a point of order against something, it requires 60 votes to waive. Okay? Most points of order require 60 votes. In this instance, most of these 18 points of order require 60 votes to waive. Now, what they have done, or what the Democratic leadership did in setting up the budget, was to structure something called reserve funds. I won't get into those unless you want to get into specifics, but basically they give the chairman of the budget committee the capacity to set up a situation where about 5 of the 18 points of order will basically be muted and won't be available to those who wish to raise them. But that still leaves a fair number of points of order, and each one of them requires a different evaluation of what the bill does. Now, the most volatile group of points of order come under what I referred to earlier as the Byrd Rule. This group of points of order are unique, and there are about 6 of them within the Byrd Rule. But they're different. Most points of order against a bill, when it's exercised, so if I raised a point of order against the reconciliation bill and was successful, under most instances, they couldn't get 60 votes to waive the point of order. The whole bill would fall. Under the Byrd Rule, only the section that the point of order is raised against falls. So if we get a health care bill that's 500 pages long, what you would do is have to go through every page, every line in that bill, and determine whether or not the policy in that line violated the Byrd Rule. And what does the Byrd Rule say essentially? Well, it essentially says that if the purposes of the language is to push forward a policy initiative as its primary goal, as versus adjusting the budget for the purposes of spending or taxing, if the primary purpose is policy as versus spending or taxing, then it falls under the Byrd Rule. Basically, this was an attempt to get at the fact that people were using reconciliation as a straw dog to pass large amounts of policy. That's the philosophy of all of the Byrd Rule amendments. They're what Byrd Rule attacks. And so you go through each line of the bill, and you say, now, is this proposal primarily a policy proposal, or does it have enough adjustments in spending or tax policy that it qualifies as a non-Byrdable item, as a budget adjustment? And it really gets to be a complicated exercise. There's a lot of gray area on this in this exercise. But interestingly enough, no elected officials play any role in making this determination. This entire determination comes down to the parliamentarian of the Senate. And so what happens is that this huge bill, 600 pages long, with maybe hundreds of Byrdable challenges, goes to the parliamentarian's office, and the parliamentarian must basically go through it page by page and make a determination, well, that's Byrdable, that's not Byrdable. That's Byrdable, that's not Byrdable. And so the entire governance relative to the bill doesn't fall to elected members of the House or elected members of the Senate. It falls to the appointed parliamentarian. And it's really a disproportionate responsibility put on him, and obviously, if you're going to be honest about it, it really sort of subverts the purposes of the democratic process, because you've basically got a non-elected appointed official essentially defining what will be in the bill and what won't be in a bill of that size and substance. And that's another one of the reasons why reconciliation makes absolutely no sense. Now, after the parliamentarian goes through the bill, and let's say we go to the floor and I make 100 points of order, which are Byrdable, and I would presume that we would be well into the hundreds at this point. And let's say he rules in my favor on, or she, there's a number of parliamentarians, but there's the senior parliamentarian, on 30 of them. So that 30 of the items are knocked out. Well, the those who support the language can challenge that, and if they get 60 votes, then that bird item will be waived. But if they don't get their 60 votes, then the item is out. So what you end up with is a bill where basically pages will have been pulled out of it as it comes off the Senate floor. Probably pretty significantly, things like a public plan. It would probably be pretty hard to write a public plan that was not a birdable event, because that is such a huge extension of policy. Now clearly it would have some. They would actually have to admit the public plan was going to create rationing in order for it to probably meet the bird standards, because they would have to show they're going to save money. So they would have to admit what they really want to do, which they're not going to do because they won't admit what they want to do. They won't even give us the bill, which has to admit what they're going to do. So as a very practical matter, things like that, big public policy issues, such as community rating, such as no pre-existing conditions being a limitation on pre-existing conditions, all of that type of language, which is core to healthcare reform, would probably be birdable, or might well be birdable. So you would pull out all these sections, and the way I've described it is you'd end up with a bill that looked like Swiss cheese. I mean, basically, you'd have a healthcare bill, but it would have all sorts of major sections missing from it that actually made it make sense. It would also have a fairly difficult vote left for whoever wanted to vote for it, because you'd have all the tax increases and all the Medicare cuts. Those would not be birdable. So you get to vote for the tax increases and the Medicare cuts, but you don't get to vote for what you might happen to like if you're, say, one of the senators on the other side of the aisle, a public plan, potentially. So it would make it a difficult situation. They could, of course, pass reconciliation as a freestanding bill by taking out all the birdable items and moving those into another bill and passing them with 60 votes, if they could get their 60 votes. So they could do what I call sidecar. They could pass the really toxic stuff that is going to be hard to explain to their constituents and even harder to explain to logic, such as the tax increases and the Medicare cuts, with 50 votes, thus allowing 10 people to take a walk, and then move the rest of the bill on a sidecar where they got their 60 votes. Now that's a tactical decision that could be made by the other side of the aisle, but it runs fairly significant risk, obviously, that one of those two bills may not pass, and it could easily create, the merging of those bills could be chaotic, to say the least. After reconciliation has been gone through, of course, the bill still has to go to conference and come back. So whatever happens in conference to reconcile a bill is again subject, when it comes back, called a birdable. So a lot of things the House of Representatives likes to do is throw in language which is birdable. And historically, even on lesser events of reconciliation, such as 2 years ago when we did the student loan bill, which was reconciled, birdable things coming from the House tend to get knocked out in the Senate, which causes the House to get out of sorts, because they don't appreciate the Senate telling them they can't have one of their items. Can't understand it, by the way. But in any event, that's the case. So there's another hurdle, and another sequence of events, and another parliamentary exercise that's extremely convoluted and Byzantine, which I think has to lead us all to the conclusion that it's really a foolish idea to use reconciliation. And it's terrible policy from a standpoint of maintaining the constitutional structure of our government. Why would you want on something, a piece of public policy this large, to eliminate the purposes of the Senate, which is to debate bills and have an open debate in an open forum and an amendable vehicle? That was what the Senate was set up to do. If we pursued this type of legislation, the single biggest piece of public policy in the post-World War II period, under reconciliation, if that was done in the Senate, you would have essentially eliminated the Senate as a functioning body relative to the purposes it was structured for under our Constitution. And it will set a precedent that will come back to haunt us for generations. And you don't have to listen to me to believe that that's so. I think it's obvious on its face. But just listen to Bob Byrd. His language is in there. I think I'm going to quote here. Senator Byrd, who is the historian of the Senate, obviously the Senator pro tempore, and the leading authority on the issue of why the reconciliation was set up, because he wrote the original Budget Act and then he wrote the Byrd amendments, says this is the wrong thing to do. You should not use, to paraphrase it, you should not use reconciliation in this way because not because he's concerned about the health care issue. It's because he's concerned about what it does to the prerogative and purpose of the Senate as being the body that's supposed to be the place where you have debate, amendments in an open forum so that issues receive reasonable airing before they're finally passed. And so that's a extended summary of how reconciliation works, hopefully. It was not too convoluted, but it is such a Byzantine exercise, even explaining it becomes a little confusing at times. I'd be happy to take any questions anybody has. Sure.